With you. We've got such a lovely program tonight. My name is Allison Wickens, and I'm the Vice President for Education here at George Washington's Mount Vernon. I want to thank, of course, our generous donor, the Ford Motor Company, as well as our amazing scholars that are here tonight to share with you some of their brilliance. Just a little bit of it, because the rest of it's in the book, right? Before we dive into this program, I did just want to announce that the next book talk will be in the new year, 2023, January 17th, and it will be the official launch of Edward Larson's new book, American Inheritance, Liberty and Slavery in the Birth of a Nation, 1765 to 1795. So hope to see you there as well. But tonight's exciting program celebrates the publication of an important new book, which actually grew out of a popular symposium we hosted several years ago, right in this very room. We were excited to share this new publication today. It's called Women in George Washington's World, and it is a collection of essays by leading historians about important women who occupied important positions in the general's personal orbit. The book's introduction is written by Dr. Cindy Kierner, who joins us tonight to moderate a discussion with our guest authors. We are very honored to have Dr. Kierner here. She is a professor of history at nearby George Mason University. She's a specialist in the fields of early America, women and gender, and early Southern history, so quite appropriate for moderating tonight's talk. She earned her PhD from the University of Virginia, and she is an OAH Distinguished Lecturer and past president of the Southern Association of Women Historians. Her research has received support from a number of organizations, including American Historical Association, Virginia Historical Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the American Antiquarian Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and most importantly, she was a member of the Washington's Library Fellows class of 2020-2021. That auspicious COVID class. I won't go into all of the books that she's written, but they do include Martha Jefferson Randolph, daughter of Monticello, Her Life and Times, which was a finalist for our 2013 George Washington Prize, and Scandal at Bazaar, Rumor and Reputation in Jefferson's America. I'm excited to share her current projects include two biographies, one of an outspoken Whig woman in revolutionary North Carolina, and the other of Joan Whitney Payson, a philanthropist and founding owner of the New York Mets. Please join me in a warm welcome, a Mount Vernon warm welcome on a cold, rainy night for Dr. Cindy Kierner and our speakers tonight. You're right here.
Oh, she's on the edge.
Okay, so this thing's still on, right? It's working? I mean, because they told me to use that, but there's that, and I'm really loud, so I don't think I need two microphones, so I think I'll stick with this one for now. It's a pleasure to be here. It was super fun working on this project with these scholars and with some other scholars who aren't here tonight, and I'm going to be the moderator. But because I'm the moderator, and because that means I have great power, as a result of that, I'm going to talk too, because it's kind of impossible to shut me up, as my friends will tonight. All right, so since I wrote the introduction to the book, and that's kind of why I'm here, it seems reasonable that I make some introductory remarks for the panel tonight. And so our editors, Charlene and George, who you'll hear from later, asked me to write the book's introduction. Well, when you're asked to write the introduction to a book, especially if they really need someone to write the introduction, you can kind of write whatever you want, so long as it's kind of relevant. And so I'm like, cool, I can do that. And there were two reasons why I chose to write in the introduction about the ladies of Trenton, New Jersey, who welcomed George Washington to their town in 1789 when he stopped there on his way to New York City, where he, of course, was going to become president. The first of those reasons has to do with the visual images of that reception that has always fascinated me. And right now I'm going to tell you to do something that, in your wildest dreams, no speaker has ever told you to do before, and that's get out your phone. I want you to get out your phone and I want you to look at it. And what I want you to do is do a Google search for Washington Ladies Trenton, those 3 words. And after you type in Washington Ladies Trenton, click on images. And once you do that, just kind of scroll through and you'll see lots of them. And all of them involve Washington on a horse surrounded by quote unquote ladies. There are various versions of visual representations of this event. Some of them are even by Currier and Ives, who were pretty famous printmakers in the 1840s and 1850s. One of the things that's striking to me about these prints is that if you look at them carefully, you will see the women's faces are all identical. It's like they had a stamp and they went lady, 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 until they felt like they had enough of them, and then they stuck old George in the middle of them. So in other words, the ladies are not represented as specific people. The other thing that's really interesting about these visual representations of the event is that if you arrange them chronologically, you would see that the numbers of women became fewer and fewer as the years passed by. As the image became more and more about Washington and less about the women. So in other words, the first version of this, which is done in the 1820s, there were like 35 women. By the time we get to Currier and Ives in the 1850s, they're like 7, right? And they're lady, 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 lady. And I mean, I think that the diminishing number of ladies in these images really does reflect changes in how the revolution was remembered and how it was commemorated over time. And we can talk about that more if you like during the Q&A. The second reason why I chose to write about the ladies of Trenton was because of the message on the banner that the women made to greet Washington, which appears in the images. It always struck me as really interesting. And for those of you who maybe haven't accessed the image, here's what it says. It says, "The hero who defended the mothers will protect the daughters." So this wasn't your usual generic tribute to the hero of the battles at Trenton and Yorktown. It wasn't even really a celebration of Washington's impending rise to the presidency. And I kind of wondered why. I also wondered why, out of all of the many towns that Washington visited, Trenton was the only one where the women were the ones who were the main attraction. They were the ones who celebrated him. They were the ones who greeted him officially. Doesn't happen anywhere else, but it happens in Trenton. Like the lottery commercial says, anything can happen in Jersey. So anyway, the question of why that happened was answered in the course of my research. As it turned out, the area in and around Trenton had been the site of rapes and attempted rapes of local women by British soldiers during the war. And it was widely known that Washington had spoken out against these attacks and that he publicly called on his own troops to treat the women better than the British did. So in that very specific and intimate way, Washington had defended and protected the ladies of Trenton and the surrounding areas, above and beyond whatever good he might have done for the area by defeating the British and their Hessian allies at the battles at Trenton and Princeton in the winter of 1776 to 77. So when the ladies of Trenton honored Washington and expressed their gratitude for his protection, they were doing more than celebrating his ability to win battles and elections. Their ceremony was about women's uniquely horrible wartime experiences. And their celebration acknowledged what Washington's actions as their defender and protector meant to them really on a personal level, on the most intimate level possible. So as it turned out, not to pat myself on the back too much, but writing about the ladies of Trenton was like a really smart move. It was kind of the perfect choice to introduce this collection of essays. Historians of women have, always argued that the past can look very, very different if we examine it from women's perspective. And that's exactly the case here in this particular episode. And that, by the way, is the overall argument of this terrific book as well, that Washington's world looks just a little bit different. If your perspective is, kind of hones in on the women and their experiences and their relationships with him. All right, so that's enough about me and about the ladies of Trenton. We can talk about them more later if you want, but now I'm going to move on to introduce the book's co-editors, who will speak a bit about the origins of their project beyond the fact that it originated in a conference here at Mount Vernon, which Allison has already told you. So our first editor is Charlene Boyer-Lewis, who's a good friend, and she's a hoot. She does some really cool history. That's a compliment. Charlene is professor of history at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. And one of the things that I've always really admired about Charlene is she just has a knack for finding just really, really cool research topics, the kind of research topics that make you say, damn, I wish I'd thought of that. So her first book, which was based on her dissertation, is called Ladies and Gentlemen on Display, Planners Society at the Virginia Spring, 1790 to 1860. So it's about rich people going on vacation. Her second book, Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte, an American aristocrat in the early republic, it's about this woman from Baltimore who marries Napoleon's brother. And the part of the book that I remember most is that she apparently wore see-through dresses in Washington, D.C. And people were like, whoa, so that's super cool as well. Yeah. So that's Charlene. Our second editor is George W. Boudreau, and George is a senior research associate at the McNeil Center at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He is also the founding editor of a scholarly journal called Early American Studies. George has extensive experience as a public historian, and he is the author of a book called Independence, A Guide to Historic Philadelphia. So if you ever go to Philadelphia and want to do history stuff, you might want to take a look at his book. He is also a co-author of a book called A Material World, Culture, Society, and the Life of Things in Early Anglo-America. And that is a super cool book about material culture, lots of pictures. So, Charlene and George, tell us a bit about the book's origins.
Well, I want to know, am I a hoot too?
He's hoot-ish.
Cindy and I had the rare thing of working together on a book during a pandemic. So I don't know, any of you remember that? And so this was a pandemic book. Again, I'll start with the generals and give the boss here the specifics. But what I really wanted to say at the start here, back in the room where it happens, and I threatened the senior staff that I would sing that song from Hamilton. But it's really wonderful to be back here. It's almost 4 years later that we gathered when I saw you for the first time in ages and met Samantha and others. And I have to say that my real expertise on this was I think probably the only person on this panel who has not taught a course on women's history. But at the end of the first night of that symposium, I said, this is a book. This hangs together. And these are stories that are largely untold using new information. And this is something we need to publish, and dragged in a subject expert with great skill and a whole bunch of emerging as well as established scholars. But what I really wanted to say is number one, thank you to Mount Vernon, who welcomed us then, but also welcomed me back the following year as your 6-month postdoctoral fellow. And that's an odd thing because you live on the place and you kind of live amongst them and fall in love with all of the wonderful folks here. And as a practicing public historian, it is you get to work with the best of the best. And I really wanted to take a moment. I don't know if Doug Bradburn, the president and CEO, is here right now. I'm seeing somebody waving at me, but I can't tell if that's Doug or not. So, but I wanted to thank Doug, who I've known since grad school days, and Stephen McLeod, who was here a moment ago. And I don't see you now, Stephen.
He's over there.
Are you? And Stephen put together this fabulous symposium that was the cornerstone of this volume, and is such an incredible supporter of researchers from around the world, and a lovely person to get to know and work with. And all of these authors, and it was, as I'll say, it was kind of a weird project because we were very early into it and still recruiting essays and doing and laying things out. When I remember the day they said, you're going to have to go into quarantine for 2 weeks. And I said, oh, it'll never work. We'll never be. But I'll go into my experience that a little bit more. But all of these authors, from very established to very emerging, produced incredible work in a very strange time. And it was an exciting thing to be a part of as a boy who's been an editor for a long time. And I want to turn this over to my longtime friend, who is much more the expert on early American women than I, to talk about how we developed.
That's why I knew you needed me when you said this has to be a book. And I was like, George, I'm just going to walk right onto this project because, it was about women. But Stephen, that symposium was amazing that you put together in November of 2018, because it really made clear where I had been going myself as a historian of women. And what Cindy said earlier is that history looks very different if you center women's experiences. So not just looking through history through women's eyes, right? But really putting women in the center of the American past. And even George Washington looks different. Mm-hmm. And so we came, 2 amazingly wonderful days that came at the beginning of my project on Peggy Shippen Arnold, Mrs. Benedict Arnold. And I just knew it was exactly what I was trying to do, is let's not just add women and kind of stir the picture, but let's rewrite American history with women's experiences centered the same as men's. And all of us in this book did that. And all of the people we brought in did it beautifully. And so I really give credit to both of us of having really good ideas of who we wanted to bring into the project, who hadn't been at the symposium, but who we knew could center women the way we wanted them to, and to retell American history from that perspective. Because what I feel like, if you've read the book, and I've run into a number of people who have said I've read the whole thing, and it makes me thrilled, to hear somebody say that, it is different. You now think about George Washington differently, I bet. He was surrounded by women. Everyone, all those men were surrounded by women, and we kind of tend to forget that. Women were everywhere and had the same experiences or had different experiences, and they weren't just sewing flags and serving tea. Women,
both things important things.
Right? Women affected the war, and women were very much affected by the war. The home front mattered just as much as any battlefield. Women experienced violence just as much as men did during the war, and the Trenton women are a really good example of that. So George and I also wanted to make sure this was an academic but public history work at the same time. And so when we were choosing who we wanted to be a part of it, we really consciously made sure we had some fabulous public historians coming on board, as well as academics. And I think the balance works. Cindy, back to you, my dear.
Madam.
Okay, is this working?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. Well, yeah, of course you can hear me. All right, so all of these scholars have contributed essays to this volume. The plan is, we'll see how good this works, that everyone gets 5 to 7 minutes to talk about their stuff.
It's
And
your job
so,
to read it out.
and apparently I'm supposed to like shut people down when they go too long. We'll see how that goes.
That's what they give
See,
you the tape.
I can nudge you. You're close. The others, it's going to be a little bit harder.
It's always the youngest boy.
First step at it. All right. So I neglected to say what Charlene has told you. Her current project is a biography of Margaret Shippen Arnold, Benedict Arnold's wife, and that's who she is going to be talking about. George is going to be talking about the enslaved women who lived in the president's house in Philadelphia. And our other 2 panelists I'm going to introduce now, who we haven't had a chance to talk about. All the way on my left, your right, is Lynn Price Robbins. Lynn has a PhD in history from George Mason University. Yay. She worked as a documentary editor for the Washington Papers and is the editor of the standalone volume called George Washington's Barbados Diary, 1751 to 1752. She's now an editor at the Papers of Abraham Lincoln. She's also the producer of a forthcoming docu-series called Revolutionary. It's about the American Revolution, duh. But the one really cool thing about that is she's the only one on this stage who has an IMDb page. So you can Google her and see that. And so drawing on her experience editing Martha Washington's papers, she'll be speaking briefly about her research on Martha Washington. And then next to Lynn's right, Samantha Snyder holds an MA in history from, can we all say it now, George Mason University, yay. And also a Master of Library Studies from the University of Wisconsin. I heard it said here tonight, and I just love this. I think this is like a t-shirt, that Sam is the loudest librarian anyone has ever met.
It wasn't me, I didn't say it.
And I mean, I just think that's lovely. That's a compliment. I think that's terrific. And in fact, some of you may know her as the research librarian here at Mount Vernon, where she has helped a lot of us here with our research. Sam has written a fair amount on Elizabeth Willing Powell and the social world of post-revolutionary Philadelphia. Her current project is a biography of Elizabeth Willing Powell, whose relationship with Washington will be the subject of her brief talk here tonight and is the subject of her terrific essay in the volume. So our presenters are going to go in the order in which their work appears in the book. So we're kind of set up on stage the right way. First, it's going to be Lynn. Oh, no, we're not at all. First, it's going to be Lynn, then it's going to be Charlene, then it's going to be Sam, and then finally it will be George. So Lynn, go for it.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. And since it's December, I thought I'd start with a little story about years ago. I was online and people were having an interesting debate about the first name of Mrs. Claus. You know, everybody said Santa Claus. Well, what's Mrs. Claus' first name? And I immediately said, well, it's Martha. And it wasn't until later that I realized I was actually morphing Mrs. Claus and Martha Washington together. And I just said, of course, it's Martha. And then I realized that was just, my vision of who Martha Washington was. And I think I'm probably not the only one in this room who, when you think of Martha Washington, think of someone who is very much like a Mrs. Claus. But fortunately, I had the chance of working on Martha Washington's papers, which came out this year for UVA Press, a little plug there. And what I quickly realized in reading her letters is that she's actually, her humanity, she's funny, she's snarky, she is very important to George Washington, to her family, and she's really relatable. One of my favorite letters was actually written during the Revolution, and she was writing home to her kids, and she said, I've written to you several times, you have not written back to me. I guess all my friends have forgotten me. No one remembers who I even am, and just so you know, I'm not writing again until I hear from you. So it was sort of this guilt trip, of the mother trying to get some letters from her children. And so I got to this, I felt like I knew her. And for this essay, I really wanted to focus on the Revolutionary War because, George Washington, commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces, but what was Martha doing at the time? And when George Washington was first assigned the role of commander-in-chief, Martha Washington, she was 44 years old. She had never left Virginia. And she had already lost 4 of her 5 children and her first husband. So this is obviously a woman who understandably has a bit of anxiety. She worries a little bit. And her goal in life was to have a family, to have a nice home, to stay in that home, and to raise that family. And I think she got pretty much the exact opposite of what she had bargained for when she married both Daniel Parke Custis and, of course, George Washington. So when George Washington was appointed commander-in-chief, one of his big worries was, what is Martha going to do without me? So he writes to her and he says, it's not my fault. I didn't ask for it. This was assigned to me. I'm so worried. You're going to be lonely. What will you do without me? And so he writes to her remaining son and says, please take care of your mother. Make sure she goes out. She sees friends. And he writes to his brother and says, make sure she visits. She's going to be home alone. Not really home alone, as we all know how plantations work, but without, George Washington. And he was very worried about her. And the part I love about that story is that as we get into close to the first winter encampment, because at this time during wars, you didn't keep fighting. You would actually stop when it became winter and you'd have a break. Nothing like today. And so that's when individuals, spouses could visit their partners. And he is the first one who writes to her and says, I know it's kind of late in the year, but wouldn't it be great if you could come and visit me in Cambridge, Massachusetts, someone who's never left Virginia. And so she's actually the one who has to follow him to the camp. And she does go, she does visit him. One of the things she says when she's at the camp is how startled she was whenever she would hear a cannon or she would hear any kind of ammunition. And she ended up spending all 8 winter encampments with the troops and with George Washington. And so if you look at that individually by day, she spent half of the war, so it's an 8-year war. She spent 4 years either traveling to see him, close by him, or with him at winter encampments. So we're talking about a woman who wanted to be at home with her children, and she is now spending 4 years out of 8 in a military encampment. So probably not among her choices of best experiences. And the first thing that really surprises her as she travels to this first winter encampment is that people care. She's in the newspaper and they say the lady of His Excellency has come through town. They had dinners for her. They had parties. And she writes to her friend and she says, they're acting like I'm some great somebody. She didn't understand that she all of a sudden now, she's a celebrity. And this is something that grows throughout the 8 years until, everyone knows who she is in America. You can say that at the end of the war that George Washington was arguably the most well-known man in America. And you could say that Martha Washington perhaps was the second. And I'll let Sam argue with that.
I think mine was the.
But some of the things she did over these 8 winter encampments, she would actually act as hostess. So in Elizabeth Drinker, Quaker, had come to visit George Washington, and she had to, Martha actually greeted people. So she greeted Elizabeth Drinker, and she would entertain her until the general would come. She would do this for foreign dignitaries. She would do this for other officers and their wives. And so it's something that she was really playing a role in sort of his social experiences during the war. A very funny quote from several of his officers, one, Nathaniel Greene in particular, said that all the officers would be so happy when she arrived at winter camp because it meant he was going to be in a better mood. So you always wanted to wait if you had to, tell him something maybe that you were worried about the reactions. Like wait until, his wife arrives, and then he'll be in a better mood, and it'll be better to speak with her. She lent her name and her efforts to fundraising. So there were several letters that went out to individuals where it says Martha Washington is asking for this, and it's how a lot of money was raised for clothing for the troops, for shoes, for footwear. And she herself actually, there was the Sentiments of an American Woman, which, feel free to look up after this, that she herself had this flyer and she sent it around to her acquaintances and her friends. So she was trying to assist with the fundraising for the troops, as well as sort of being an uplifting figure when she was there in the winter encampments. Another thing she did is she really had to keep up with Mount Vernon. And so in all of these winters away, she is writing home and she is saying, okay, make sure this is done, make sure this is done. And, just to mention that, of course, she was the owner of quite a few enslaved people. And she would write and list specific individuals and ask if they had done specific tasks. Have they done this many shirts? Have they spun this much wool? Very, very specific. And this is something she is doing from a military encampment, far away from home, but she still wants to be in charge of what's going on at her home in Mount Vernon. And I'm not going to go much longer because I know I'm coming to my end. So a few more things that happened to her that I'll quickly go through that you can learn more about in the book is that in order to go to this camp, she had to be inoculated for smallpox, which was not a simple or safe, well, we would not consider it safe, most likely at this time. She missed the birth of three of her four grandchildren. So you can imagine for a family woman how difficult this would be for her. She lost her last child. She lost Jackie in 1781 after the Battle of Yorktown. And the next day, her husband had to leave because he had to go back to work being the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. So she didn't even have her husband there to help console her. There were threats to Mount Vernon from the HMS Savage, something else to Google. And also her health each year became progressively worse and worse. So in the last year, she had jaundice, she was having stomach issues. And so this is something not only was she, making a difference in the war and in the individuals she encountered, but she was also losing something in return. So she was sacrificing, seeing her children, her grandchildren, but also her health got progressively worse as each encampment went by. And so it's really, for me, just something to think about when we think about the Revolutionary War. Yes, the military was very important. Yes, the battles were very important. But there was a lot going on behind the scenes. And I think that understanding what Martha Washington, sort of the role that she played, can open up a lot of doors for other ladies and what their roles were during the war. And that it's not just about men and battles. So thank you.
So you can see why this is a fabulous book already, right? So I'm writing about a woman who was not nearly as nice to George Washington, who wasn't nearly as helpful, but played an incredibly important role. You guys are so well educated, most of you in this audience. So I'll just do a brief synopsis of that Benedict Arnold treason thing. And so, Benedict and Peggy kind of disgruntled with how the Americans were treating them and needing more prestige, and some people say needing more money, and decided, British is probably our best bet. And so in September of 1780, Benedict Arnold had the command of West Point up in the highlands of New York, and his wife, Margaret, joins him there in September with her son. And the plot is already underway to turn over West Point to the British. We already know, already happening by September 1780. They also discover that George Washington's going to be making a visit to West Point by the end of September. So now there's the idea that they might possibly be able to help kidnap George Washington. So I argue that Peggy Shippen Arnold is probably the most dangerous loyalist woman George Washington had ever met, though he didn't know it. That she was his most dangerous loyalist woman. So in September of 1780, on September 25th of 1780, John Andre, who was working with them, he was a British officer for Sir Henry Clinton, he gets arrested with the plans and other letters of the West Point fort in his boots. And they also find a pass that Benedict Arnold had written for him. So the jig is up. John Andre is arrested, and they send a message to Benedict Arnold because, of course, he's the general of West Point. Nobody knows yet what's going on. And they say, hey, we caught this man named John Andre, and he's got all this stuff in his boots. And then they finally realize the pass is from Benedict Arnold. And so Benedict Arnold understands long before the American army did that he was in trouble. So he leaves and leaves his wife and their infant child at his house, Robinson House, across the water from West Point, and leaves her to face the music because he gets on a British ship and leaves her there with below stairs. She's upstairs in her bedroom having hysterics, as I think we all would. George Washington's there. Alexander Hamilton's there. The Marquis de Lafayette is there. And General Henry Knox is there. And there she is with her child. And the jig is up. And so she so successfully maneuvers this partly out of her own emotional breakdown. I think we can all understand why she'd have an emotional breakdown. And reacts the way a lady is supposed to react. And they are gentlemen, and they react the way gentlemen are supposed to react. That nobody assumes she was part of this plot, and they let her go. And nobody has ever interviewed her about any of it. They all believe she's innocent. She chooses to return to her family in Philadelphia, even though she was offered to go over the lines and meet her husband. And she says, no, I'll go home to my family in Philadelphia instead of my husband in New York. And then the Supreme Executive Council, Joseph Reed, who had always hated Benedict Arnold, decides she is too dangerous. What are we doing? Why is she in Philadelphia? And so they order her exiled. And so she's exiled from Pennsylvania as a threat to the Republic. That's the word that they use. And she's ordered that she cannot return to the United States until the war is over. So she had chosen this role, right? As I say, she went from loyalist flirt when she flirted with all the British officers to a patriot wife when she married Benedict Arnold. And then she became, right, this incredibly dangerous loyalist woman when they decided to turn over West Point. So she ends up being with Benedict, even though she hadn't chosen it. And I argue that actually considering her a part of the plot isn't that extraordinary. Some historians have blame it all on her. Some historians say she has nothing to do with it. It's clearly she was a part of the plot. She's part of the letters from the very beginning. She was given a code name from the very beginning. She was encouraged to write letters to a mutual friend between she and John Andre. And then in invisible ink, literally interlined, they would have secret messages in between. And these are letters that only Peggy can write. And so it's clearly she's a part of this plot. She was the only one who knew what Benedict was up to, and she kept her mouth shut when he leaves, right? And the go-betweens met with her, left letters with her. She would send letters to Benedict from the go-betweens. It's clear she was a part of the plot. The British knew she was a part of the plot because when it's all over with, she gets 500 pounds a year from the British. That's an extraordinary amount of money. Almost no other woman even gets anywhere close to that. The highest I can find of loyalist women is 30 pounds a year, and she got 500 pounds a year. And Benedict says she got 500 pounds a year for, quote, the hazards she run. When you run hazards, that was words that they used for spies and taking risky actions. She clearly took risky actions. She wasn't just this passive wife. So moving her to the center of the treason, which is what I do in this essay, really rewrites not just the West Point treason, but I think rewrites the American Revolution when you put her at the center of the story right there with Benedict. And so we make the treason not a story of this disgruntled war hero, but of a married couple who are making decisions about their future. And we move the picture away from battlefields and forts into a domestic environment, a bedroom where Benedict Arnold tells her the jig is up, right? And she has her hysterics. And we move it into a realm of not just a domestic environment, but a thing that concerned a family and a family making choices. And so we shift that view, right, to include what mattered to women, choices about loyalty, choices about politics, choices about, do I want to be a monarchical subject or do I want to be a citizen? Peggy thought about those things just like Benedict. She was a supportive wife, just like Martha Washington, just like Abigail Adams. And if her husband had stayed the hero of Saratoga, we'd all think they were fabulous. But he didn't. And she made choices with him. And those choices probably didn't have the consequences they wanted. It moved them to England. And it gave them a very different future, but she was very much a part of it. And so rewriting it with her, just as much of an actor, illuminates that whole thing very differently. So I'm writing a whole biography of her. It's going to be about her, and Benedict's going to be just this little guy on the side. And I think we're going to see lots of different ways that the revolution looks different as more and more of us do that.
Thank you very much for that. I think my biography of Elizabeth Powell is going to do something very similar with George Washington. So George Washington and Elizabeth Powell treated Washington, I would say, a happy medium of how Martha Washington and Peggy Arnold were with Washington. She was a very bright, witty socialite in Philadelphia who, when George Washington met her in the 1770s, was already incredibly well connected in the city. She was related to Peggy Shippen. Her mother was a Shippen. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest merchants in Philadelphia, Charles Lynn. She was the 6th child of 10 of this very large, very prominent family. And that whole story, her early story, matters too, for setting up her life to when she met George Washington. And the point of my chapter is to pull her out from George Washington's story, to not just be his very close friend, which is what she was. She was his close friend, his political advisor, his kind of sounding board, but really she lived a life far outside of him. But in the chapter also, you'll see that Elizabeth Powell was not only friends with Washington, but friends with his nephew, Bushrod, friends with his grandchildren. Eleanor Parke Custis specifically, she was very close with. But the Powells, they really mattered to the Washingtons in a way that not a lot of people did. They got connected with Washington at a deeper level than just the political friends that Washington had. And that I find really interesting and kind of rare. And I'm very lucky that I came across, I started working at Mount Vernon and found this amazing set of letters and realized there is something here with this story. We have a set of letters between her and George Washington, Samuel Powell and George Washington. Samuel was her husband, her and Martha Washington. But it really, as I read these letters and saw her life unfold, I realized just how well connected she was with everyone. But I think the most important part of her relationship with Washington, and it's one of many, but she is the one who was tasked with, she was the one who got him to serve a second term as president. So without her, there would be no 2-term presidency today. So you'll see more about that in my chapter. There's a very special letter that we have in our collection that you can read more about. But that is really my chapter. That is a very bite-sized version of my chapter, but I know we are continuing on with our time. So
You're under
Turn
time.
it up, George.
I'll yell once again one of my loudest huzzahs to Samantha, who, when I was invited here to speak about Elizabeth Willing Powell 4 years ago, met her and said, "You have this amazing emerging scholar who is somewhat younger than I am, at least 4 or 5 years." So when we started planning the book, I said, I really want Samantha to write this. One of the most exciting things for me as the former site director of the Powell House was that she has gotten into the primary sources more than anyone in history. And so that was extremely exciting. History is only about digging into old paper and old stuff. And if we don't do that, and we don't have projects like Lynn's, then, well, we're lost. My path to my chapter was somewhat different. And I've got to tell you all, sitting here in these very posh surroundings, I keep looking down and noting you can tell people who are primarily working in academic history. I forgot to change out of my public history boots today. And these have gone through multiple historic sites and 2 archaeological digs, and were fully submerged on Mount Vernon lawn today. And I forgot to change out of them before this talk. So that's the feat of public history. These are, this chapter very much grows out of my work in public history and a moment in time, well, several moments in time in Philadelphia, which has been my home for almost 30 years, golly. And that was in the mid-90s, there was a discussion of the building of the new Liberty Bell building, and a local antiquarian essentially brought up, well, isn't this where the Washingtons lived as president? And the National Park Service sort of brushed this off and said, we don't really, that's not what we're doing here. That's not what we're about. And then other local community organizers said, well, didn't the Washingtons keep enslaved people? They said back then, they said, didn't they own slaves who lived on this site? And the Park Service said, no, we're not getting into that at all. And this was a very poor decision by some friends who work with the National Park Service, and then we got in the middle. And I still remember the day that this burst under the Philadelphia Inquirer, and a man who I respect and who is still alive walked up to me on the street and said, did you know George Washington owned slaves? And I remember looking at him square in the eye and saying, duh. And he looked something aback, and I said, who do you think was growing crops at Mount Vernon? And the response was something, well, I didn't know Mount Vernon was a farm. But this grows out of that. And my initial research into the life of the women who lived at 190 High Street while enslaved began then and emerged more in my book Independence, which is a 10-year-old book now, which is a little scary. It's like having a child getting ready to drive or something. But it grew out of this and getting deep into the record that exists of these women. And then when Charlene and I began organizing this book later in 2019 and getting, really what do chapters need to be about, this was one of the topics we brought up, and we actually approached a couple other historians who were not available or their work was being published elsewhere. And the boss here, as I still call her, informed me that I was going to write this chapter. And I thought, easy enough.
I said you're one of the best Philadelphia historians.
Well, that was kind. So we moved into this, and I said, well, that's easy. I'll simply spend the spring and summer of 2020 going back to Mount Vernon and going through the documentary evidence. So we didn't do that. Fortunately, the National Park Service very kindly considers me a volunteer in the park and allowed me not just to use the park's archives, which includes decades of collecting about the now lost President's House at 190 High Street, but also literally to be alone in the building with the chief curator, she conserving items, and me working alone in a very large library, sort of lonely, but and going through these papers. And what I wanted to do, what I mostly do is I write about people in spaces. If I'm going to write about something, I need to be able to walk through it. And so that was why it was a thrill to get to go back into the house today and to get to go up and see the steps to the cupola and see the room where Martha burned letters and other things. But I write about people in spaces. And I started thinking about George Washington in Philadelphia because was there a story that connected the general, as my friends who are members of the Society of the Cincinnati still call him, the general, and to this space where he was the first president of the United States. And immediately within the first letter that I was allowed to read because of the good offices of the papers of George Washington, one of the first things he's thinking about is Mrs. Washington, the children, and the nannies. That he was looking for bedroom space and office space and play space for this family that he had been patriarch of. But the fact that these two African-American women who traveled to Philadelphia in 1790 were going to be a part of the story. And so I began looking into them. I'll ask a question to the audience, and I know I have about 3 minutes left by my
Two.
Okay. How many of us had heard of Ona Judge more than 10 years ago? A couple? Yeah. Now, is there anyone in the room who doesn't know who she was? I hope not. Very much my thinking on this grew out of Mount Vernon's public history staff and Jesse McLeod's incredible installation of the slavery show, as it was popularly called, and the wonderful amount of research that went into that, and the continuing work, the seminal work by our friend and our colleague Mary Thompson, who has another essay in this book, and the incredible work being done every day by the interpretive staff and the educators to tell these stories. Ona is a young woman brought north in chains, enslaved, who, as we very luckily found two documents that interview her as an old lady, maybe arguably the first slave narrative written by a Black woman in America, in which she used the statement that I stole as my chapter title. I had made friends among the colored people of the town. And we all know Ona's story, which is famous and very important, as the person who escaped the Washingtons and stayed away. What did it mean that all these decades later, she was reacting to a community? And so I began building on earlier projects of people Ona would have passed on the street, people she would have gone to church with, although one of the surprises of this essay was George and Martha didn't catechize their enslaved Blacks. What did it mean to live in that experience? And for this young woman to live in two northern cities, I will admit, the New York pages hit the cutting room floor as the book went to editing. Sorry, New York, somebody else can write that. But to get into this, and to get into the story of this woman who found freedom in a northern capital. And I am at my 7 minutes. So if you have any questions about that, I'll answer them really quickly.
Wow.
Oh,
All right. So I actually had some questions that I wanted to ask the panel, but since we're supposed to end at 8, we can go longer. They own the room, so we can stay. But I think it might make more sense to open it up to the audience for you guys to ask questions. And probably the best thing for me to do would be to call on people. I think it's a room that's probably small enough that you don't need a microphone to ask your question, and tell us also, who it is that you're addressing your question to. I mean, unless and who you are, if you want to share that. And if you don't, that is fine as well. I will do that. Yes. Yeah, because streaming. Yes. Okay. So does anybody have any questions for our illustrious panel? Yes, you in the middle.
My name is Ike. I'm one of the history interpreters here at Mount Vernon. My question is for the two editors. As a question of, was there any topic or individual woman that sort of, weren't able to get in the book? Or if you could add one more person, one more chapter, what would be that dream addition to the book?
That's great. Ike asked our two editors, Charlene and George, if there was one woman who they would have liked to have gotten into the book, but weren't able to for whatever reason, who that might be.
I'd say there were a bunch.
We have a long list.
Charlene and I, we had many. I still, it says in my phone, just coffee with Charlene many times. We really dug hard into trying to get more members of the extended Washington family, both generation before and the later generations of females, all of which we either, I had this dream of writing a biography of Washington's sister based on Jill Lepore's fabulous book about Benjamin Franklin's sister, Jane Franklin Bache. The papers aren't there. They're just, George and Betty didn't write voluminous letters, which I wish they had.
But that's probably the one we really wanted was Betty Lewis, and it couldn't happen because.
Did you know George Washington had a sister?
Exactly.
Most people don't,
Exactly.
right?
And
They know about
that's
his
why we
brothers
wanted
and Bushrod and all those people. My students love that name.
Bushrod.
Bushrod.
And we were very excited to get brand new work on Washington's mother.
Right.
And I have to admit,
Right,
I drove to
Comment.
Fredericksburg yesterday just to see her gravestone after editing this
Right.
essay for the last 2
Right.
years. So that was one, and there were several others. One of the problems of an edited collection is there's always stuff that's been promised elsewhere. One of our invited essays already had a book contract for her book on the Washington granddaughters.
Right.
One was an essay on Mercy Otis Warren that we drooled over, but she had it committed elsewhere. And there were, one of the exciting moments right now is UVA Press seems to just be, this plow of creating great new work on early American women at the moment. And there were 3 volumes. I was at one program and I said, "Oh, we want your essay," and she was already in another book. So
Okay, do we have
that's a great question.
Do we have that is a great question. Do we have another question from the audience? Yes.
This question is for Dr. Lewis. I wonder if you can address more details about the invisible ink that fascinated us.
Can you make it yourself?
It's good.
Okay, wait.
It's a
I was
good
supposed to
story,
repeat
isn't
the
it?
question.
Sorry.
She wants to know more about the invisible ink. Do you have a recipe you could share perhaps?
I do not. So John Andre Andre was secretly the spy master for Clinton. So there are literally recipes for this stuff. But one of the go-betweens told Benedict Arnold how to do that. So we don't have Andre telling him how to do it, but he writes, we will write in invisible ink. And so, so that means Benedict either had to figure out what we think one of the go-betweens told him, and then you would pour acid on it, and the invisible ink would come back to life. Right. I've seen the brought back to life papers. They're at Clements Library in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan, and you can see a couple of the spy letters there.
Haven't some of them been digitized
they've
as
been
well? I mean, I think
digitized,
you can see them on the internet, at least some of them.
It's
Yeah.
cooler to see them in person.
Well, yeah.
Andre's a fascinating, awful person. I would have slapped him.
Oh, no. He's my history crime.
We have,
Yes.
we have another question over here, sir.
If you could put yourself in Martha Washington's mind, John Adams' wife kept all these wonderful letters, and we know so much about history. Martha kept all those letters, but upon hearing of his death, she burned them. Why keep them if you're going to burn them? What was her mindset there? Was she just so distraught? If she had waited a week or two, would she have kept them? Put yourself in her mind.
Okay, so here's a question for Lynn Price Robbins about Martha Washington burning her husband's letters after he died. And his question is basically, what was this woman thinking? Why do you think she did this? Can you put yourself in her place and
Absolutely.
think about that?
And this wasn't, she's not the only one who did it. There were other spouses where whoever died first, the other one would burn all of the letters. And I look at it as, this is the personal side. This is a very personal relationship with your spouse. I'm sure you've written at least one love letter in your life, perhaps to a spouse. And that might not be something that, you would want someone to copy and put up on Facebook. And so I think this was the intimate relationship, the one-on-one, the friendship. And don't get me wrong, I would have loved to see these letters and to really see the way that they interacted, because when you have third parties who explain their relationship, it's very clear that it was a loving relationship, but also very respectful on both sides, and very warm and intellectual. It was friendship and love. But I think if you think about just texts or emails that you write to your best friend or to your spouse, these aren't things that you want the world to see, because they knew they were already famous. So she knew when George Washington died that all of his papers were saved, and that eventually people were going to be able to read them. Now, whether or not she thought, well, they would read the ones between her and her husband, I think it's very understandable that that's a part of her life that she didn't want to share with the world. And something that she generally talked about in her letters was how her and Washington's life was sort of given up to, civil service. It was given to the United States. And so this was something that was just theirs, something that couldn't be taken from them, that they could keep private and would just be between the two of them. And so in that way, and I'm not saying there was anything scandalous in the letters, but one likes to imagine. But I think it was just part of her life that she wanted to keep as just in them, and something, personal between them. And so in that way, I can certainly understand. But as a historian, it breaks my heart. So it's the two-sided. But thank you.
But you're right that it's common.
Yeah.
I mean, there are lots of spouses who are doing this.
Right.
The letters are the ones you find in archives that actually say, burn this letter. Right. Sir.
Yes, I wonder if, Samantha, they talk a lot about George and Elizabeth William Powell, but there was a period where in Philadelphia you also had two other very prominent women, Martha Washington and Abigail Adams, as the vice president's wife. Do you know anything about the relationship between those three women? And
So this is a question about Sam, and she'll get those minutes back that she gave up at the end of her talk. The question was about the relationship between Elizabeth Willing Powell and the other two really famous prominent women in Philadelphia when it was the Capitol, which was Martha Washington and Abigail Adams.
Yes, that is a great question. I know a lot about their relationship. It was a very, very good one. There was no weird blood between Martha Washington and Elizabeth Powell, and Elizabeth Powell. They were quite close to, but I would say I know more about kind of Elizabeth and Martha, and then Elizabeth and Abigail. Elizabeth Powell and Abigail Adams were very, very similar, and they seemed to have a lot of mutual respect for one another. So much so that she had a hard time making it not clear how much she did not like John Adams, but really loved Abigail. So there is a great letter where John Adams himself explains that he knew that Elizabeth Powell never liked him very much, but he loved her, and he loved how much she loved Abigail. But she and Abigail were very intellectually similar. The interesting thing about the two of them is that Abigail was not always in Philadelphia. There's a lot more letters between John and Abigail where you can kind of see the way Abigail was in her writing. You can see her thoughts a lot clearer than Elizabeth Powell, but they were very similar, and I would like to think I would love to see a conversation between the two of them. But I think Martha and Elizabeth Powell also had a very close connection. I would say it was intellectual, but it was also very emotional because, like Martha, she lost all four of her children too, and she lost two as stillborns, and one lived to be just over a year old, and the other lived to be just 2 weeks old. So I think that Martha and her probably bonded about that. They also bonded over their mutual affinity for the general. And there is one of my favorite letters from the Martha Elizabeth correspondence is when she sends Martha Martinique, like some sort of alcohol, some sort of cocktail, because she knows that Washington is going to be tired after giving what is the last annual address to Congress.
So what he needs to do is drink.
Yeah. She's like, oh, I know that you're not feeling or I know you weren't feeling well, and you can take this for coughing, but I think you should give some to the general because I know he's going to do that.
Oh, so it's like a cordial,
cordial.
So if we're getting into
martini,
recipes for Charlene, do you have this recipe? Can we try that?
I did look it up I did try to find it in an 18th century cookbooks, and I did find something very similar. So,
Here we go.
so I don't know. We can make an appendix.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Any other questions? Yes, you.
Yes, we heard you, Cindy. We heard you talk about how the view of these women in Trenton changes over time. But my question is also for Sam, and wondering if she could speak to the view that historians have had it with Elizabeth Powell and how that changes throughout time.
Yes, absolutely. So
this was a question about how. They told me I had to. A question about how historical views of Elizabeth Powell have changed over time, and really how, in a way, you've kind of discovered this incredibly important woman.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. So that was a really great question. So Elizabeth Powell, I don't know how many of you have ever seen her name pop up in a Washington biography. She normally does now. She'll kind of appear and disappear. And she appears as this woman who is just this brilliant intellectual, but then as soon as George Washington dies, she just kind of goes away. But in the 1980s is really I've read multiple biographies. There comes a change where she suddenly becomes sort of this flirty friend of Washington's who's very sort of not airheaded, but just kind of like social butterfly. Like they start an author, James Flexner, pits Martha Washington and Elizabeth Powell against each other, and Martha is plain, Elizabeth is flirty and fun. And you start to see a lot of authors say they potentially had a romantic relationship. I have found that is by no means true. Digging into the sources of Elizabeth Powell's life, far outside of her life with Washington. You can very much tell she and her husband had a very similar relationship, I would say, to George and Martha, very respectful, very loving. But yeah, so I guess the way she's changed over time and the way I am hoping to portray her is that she was far beyond Washington's little intellectual friend who floats in and floats out. She really, she lived an incredible life, an incredible long life.
I just want to add something to that, because that's what a lot of what recent historians of women are trying to do, right? They don't just come on a stage for a little bit of time, which is how women have often been portrayed when they're connected to one of the founding fathers. Or, you know, I make fun of flag sewers, but, you know, we have like Betsy Ross there and then she goes away. Women didn't do that. They didn't just appear on a stage for this little moment. Peggy Shippen Arnold didn't just exist at West Point. But that's so many times the way historians have treated women. They're just there for this moment and then they retreat as if they don't exist, beyond their one moment where they're connected to this more important man. And so this, what all of us are involved in is making that clear, that they don't just show up and then disappear. Yes.
And Lynn had mentioned the sentiments of an American woman and the fundraising effort on behalf of the Continental Army. I mean, the ladies of Trenton, the overwhelming majority of the ones who would have been grown-ups in 1780 when that sort of thing was happening, were involved in that effort. And I mean, one of the things that I think I might try to do is try to figure out what they did after 1789. And I would be really curious to know if there are circles of these like sort of politically engaged women in smaller communities like Trenton, as there were clearly in places like Philadelphia and later in Washington, D.C. Any other questions for our audience? Yes.
Just a quick comment. Politically engaged women in the one state where they could vote.
Right.
That's right. And in fact, you know, certain, I think there were like 2 or 3 of the ladies of Trenton who were widows, and presumably they had voted for George Washington, because I think everyone voted for George Washington. Yeah, right? I mean, isn't that kind of the way it went? So yeah, I mean, so that's super interesting as well. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, we did run 10 minutes over, but no one left, so that's cool. Thank you so much for coming out on a miserable night. I hope it's not sleeting and stuff when we go outside, but have a great evening, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.